"You're not going to believe this," Mark said to his buddy, Dave, his eyes wide with excitement as they sat at the local diner. "Guess who I saw at the office today?" Dave took a sip of his coffee, eyeing Mark over the rim of his mug. "Who?" "Linda," Mark whispered, leaning in close as if the walls had ears. "You remember, right? The girl from that small town who used to work at the grocery store?" Dave nodded slowly, recalling her name. "The one with the..." He gestured at his own face, hinting at her beauty. "The very one," Mark said, smiling like a Cheshire cat. "Turns out she started interning at the firm. Can you believe it?" They had met 5 years ago when Mark was passing through Linda's hometown for his cousin's wedding. She was a vision of loveliness, her eyes sparkling like stars in the rural night, her smile as warm as the summer breeze. Despite her humble background, Linda had an air of ambition about her that drew Mark in like a moth to a flame. He was a city boy with a stable, if unspectacular, job and the prospect of climbing the corporate ladder. They had hit it off immediately, talking into the early hours about their hopes and dreams. She had talked about moving to the city, to escape the drudgery of small-town life and make something of herself. Mark had been smitten. Her family had struggled to make ends meet, her mother working 2 jobs and her father's health failings, leaving Linda to help support them. Despite their financial woes, she had managed to put herself through college with a scholarship. She had dreams of becoming a journalist, to tell the stories of the unheard, to make a difference. Mark had promised to help her find a job in the city when she graduated. He had kept his promise, and here she was, a bright new intern with the same big dreams in her eyes that had captivated him all those years ago. "Wow," Dave said, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. "How's she holding up in the big city?" "Better than anyone expected, I think," Mark said, his gaze drifting off into the distance. "She's got this fire in her. It's like nothing can hold her back." Their conversation was interrupted by the chiming of Mark's phone. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the screen. "It's from Linda," he said, his cheeks coloring slightly. "She wants to grab dinner tonight to catch up." Dave clapped him on the back. "You go for it, buddy. You two always had something special." Mark nodded, a grin spreading across his face. He had always felt a connection with Linda, but the timing had never been right. Now, with her in the city and their paths crossing again, maybe it was their chance to finally see where that spark could lead. As they parted ways, Mark couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. He had always felt protective of Linda, knowing the challenges she faced. But now, with her so close and looking up at him with those hopeful eyes, he realized that his feelings ran much deeper than friendship. He wondered if she felt the same way, if the years had changed her as much as they had him. The evening came, and Mark found himself standing outside the swanky restaurant Linda had suggested, feeling a little out of place in his best suit. The city lights reflected off the sleek cars parked nearby, a stark contrast to the dusty streets of her hometown. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the start of something significant. When she arrived, she took his breath away. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. She had blossomed into a woman, and the small-town girl he had once known had been replaced by a sophisticated beauty. "Mark," she said, her voice a melody that resonated through him. "It's been too long." He took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. "You look incredible, Linda." The night was filled with laughter and reminiscing. They talked about their shared past, the quiet comfort of her hometown, and the chaos of the city. Linda spoke of her dreams with a passion that made Mark's heart race. Her determination to make it as a journalist was as fiery as the sunsets they had watched together. Over dinner, their conversation grew more intimate, and Mark found himself sharing his deepest fears and aspirations. They had both changed since their last meeting, but the bond between them remained unshaken. "I can't believe you're here," Linda said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "This all feels like a dream." "You made it happen," Mark replied, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand. "You're the one who's come so far." Their gazes held, and for a moment, it felt like the world around them had stopped spinning. They saw in each other a kindred spirit, a person who understood the depths of their soul. It was as if fate had conspired to bring them back together. Weeks turned into months, and their friendship grew into something more profound. They spent their free time exploring the city, finding hidden gems that only locals knew about. Linda showed Mark the art of patience as she navigated the complexities of her internship, and Mark helped her network and find her footing in the corporate jungle. They supported each other through the trials of their new lives, their bond deepening with every shared victory and defeat. One evening, as they strolled along the riverbank, the city lights dancing on the water's surface, Mark took a deep breath. "Linda," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's time I tell you something." Her eyes searched his, a question in their depths. "What is it?" "I've been in love with you since the moment we met," he confessed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know it sounds crazy, but I can't ignore it anymore." Linda's smile was soft, her voice gentle. "Mark," she said, taking a step closer to him. "I've felt the same way." The confession hung in the air, a bridge connecting their hearts. They stood there, the city's pulse a backdrop to their silent revelation, until Linda leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss filled with all the love and longing they had both held within for so long. Their relationship grew from that moment, a love story written in the stars. They faced challenges, of course, the long hours at work, the jealous glances from colleagues, the fear of failure that loomed over Linda's career. But with each hurdle, they only grew stronger, their love a beacon guiding them through the fog. 1 year later, Mark got down on one knee in the very spot where they had first kissed. The ring in his hand caught the moonlight, a symbol of their commitment to each other. "Linda," he whispered, "will you marry me?" Her eyes brimming with happiness, she nodded. "Yes, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "1,000 times, yes." And so, they did. Their wedding was a small affair, surrounded by their closest friends and family. Linda looked radiant in a simple gown that made her look like the star she had always been destined to become. Mark couldn't take his eyes off her, his heart swelling with pride and love. As they danced their first dance, the world around them faded away. All that mattered was the warmth of her hand in his, the promise of forever in their hearts. They had come so far from those stolen moments at the grocery store, but here they were, together, ready to conquer whatever life threw their way. Their marriage was a whirlwind of love and support. Mark helped Linda climb the corporate ladder, her byline appearing in more and more prestigious publications. Linda, in turn, encouraged Mark to pursue his own dreams, pushing him to take risks that would lead to his promotion. Their life was filled with joy and ambition, a testament to their unyielding spirit. Then, one day, Linda's firm announced a new boss, a suave, wealthy man named Richard. He strutted into the office with an air of authority that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. His suits were tailored to perfection, his shoes gleaming with an untouchable shine. He had the kind of charisma that could charm the birds from the trees. "Mark, you wouldn't believe the office today," Linda said one evening as she kicked off her heels and flopped onto the couch. "We've got a new boss, and he's, wow." "Yeah?" Mark asked, not looking up from his laptop. "What's so special about him?" "Everything," Linda said, her eyes distant. "He's so successful. He's been all over the world, has the most amazing stories. And his apartment, it's like something out of a magazine." Over time, Mark noticed a change in Linda. She started to work longer hours, often coming home tired and distant. She talked more and more about Richard, his fancy dinners and the extravagant parties he threw. A twinge of discomfort grew in Mark's stomach as he realized she was beginning to resent their simple life. One night, as they lay in bed, Linda rolled over to face him. "I don't know if this is what I want anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This normalcy." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his heart racing. "Look at Richard," she said. "He has everything. The success, the wealth, the lifestyle. And here we are, in this tiny apartment, barely scraping by." "But we're happy," Mark said, his voice desperate. "Isn't that what matters?" Linda was silent for a moment before she spoke again. "I don't know if it's enough for me." Their conversations grew more infrequent, the space between them stretching wider with each passing day. Mark tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, focusing on his work and their life together. But the glamour of Richard's world had seeped into Linda's heart, and she found it increasingly difficult to resist. One evening, Mark walked in on Linda and Richard, their heads close together, whispering secrets in the dimly lit living room. The sight of them made his blood boil, but he held his tongue, biding his time. He knew Linda didn't want to hurt him, but her desire for the life Richard offered was too strong. "What's going on here?" Mark asked, his voice tight with anger. Linda looked up, a mix of guilt and defiance in her eyes. "Mark, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaking. Richard stood, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Why don't you tell him?" he suggested, crossing his arms over his chest. Taking a deep breath, Linda explained their twisted plan. "We thought if Richard threatened you with a divorce, with leaving you with nothing, you would understand why I have to be with him," she said, her eyes pleading. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I need more than this." Mark's fists clenched at his sides. He had killed for his country, had seen the worst of humanity, and now this. But he knew better than to act on his rage. He had to play the game, to protect himself and the life they had built together. "I see," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "And you thought I would just accept that?" Linda nodded, hopeful. "You wouldn't want me to be unhappy, would you?" He looked at her, the love he had once felt now a distant memory. "No," he said, his voice a whisper. "I wouldn't want that." For 3 days, Mark remained silent, his eyes following Linda like a hawk as she packed her bags and left with Richard. The apartment felt empty without her, the echo of her laughter a taunting reminder of their shattered dreams. But Mark was no ordinary husband. He had a plan, one that would teach them both a lesson they would never forget. As Linda stepped out with her boss, Mark retreated to his study. He pulled out an old military file, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn photographs within. The memories flooded back, the missions, the kills, the cold precision that had earned him his reputation. It was a part of him he had buried deep, but now it roared back to the surface, demanding action. The plan was simple, yet complex in its execution. First, he would need to isolate Richard from his usual circle, to make him vulnerable. He waited patiently, biding his time as he listened to Linda's stories of Richard's late-night calls and emergency meetings. Mark knew the type, a man who believed his charm could bend the world to his will. He would exploit that point. One such evening, Mark called Linda, his voice calm and measured. "There's an emergency at work," he said, fabricating a scenario that would pull her away from Richard's side. "I need you to come in right away." Her hesitation was palpable, but her love for Mark won out. "Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can," she replied, the fear in her voice a sweet symphony to his ears. As she rushed to the office, Mark waited for Richard to follow his usual routine. The penthouse gym, the solo dinners at the rooftop restaurant, the lonely nights spent in his opulent apartment. It was during one such dinner that Mark struck, slipping into the building unnoticed, his combat boots silent on the marble floors. He found Richard in his office, surrounded by the spoils of his conquests. The man looked up, surprise flitting across his features before Mark's fist met his jaw. The fight was swift and brutal, a dance of rage and skill. When Richard was unconscious, Mark dragged him into a nearby storage room, his mind racing with the next step of his meticulous plan. He knew Richard's penchant for extreme sports, his weekly rendezvous with danger. It would be easy to make it look like an accident. With surgical precision, Mark bound Richard's hands and feet, attaching weights to his body. He drove to the docks, the trunk of his car heavy with the burden of his enemy. The water was cold and unforgiving as Mark heaved Richard's body into the river. He watched the ripples spread, the dark water swallowing the man whole. He felt nothing but a grim satisfaction as he drove away, leaving no trace of his presence. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Richard continued. Linda called, her voice trembling with fear. "They can't find him," she said, the horror of what she had unleashed gnawing at her conscience. "What have we done?" Mark listened, his silence a weapon sharper than any blade. "You did this, Linda," he said, his voice like ice. "You chose this path. The fear grew in her eyes with every passing day, her guilt a living, breathing thing that consumed her from within. She knew Mark was capable of anything, had seen the darkness in his eyes that night. And she feared that she was next. In the end, it was Linda who couldn't bear the weight of their shared secret. She disappeared without a trace, leaving only a note that read, "I'm sorry." The police questioned Mark, but he played the part of the grieving husband to perfection, his alibi as solid as the fear that now ruled Linda's life. The case went cold, and Mark went on with his life, the ghost of Richard haunting him no more. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he knew Linda was out there, running from the specter of the man she had betrayed. And in those moments, he allowed himself a small, cruel smile, knowing that her fear was the ultimate revenge. Time healed some wounds, though not all. Mark threw himself into his work, his sharp mind and steely resolve earning him a promotion to a position that had once been Richard's. He bought a new house in the suburbs, trading the echoes of their old apartment for the laughter of children. He met a woman named Emily, a kindergarten teacher with a heart as warm as the sun. She saw the shadows that lingered in his eyes but didn't shy away from them. They fell in love, slowly, tentatively, building a life together that felt more real than any fairy tale. Years later, Mark stood in a bustling market, his hand in Emily's, their two kids racing ahead, their laughter like music. And then, he saw her, Linda. Her once radiant beauty was now tarnished, her eyes haunted. She was a shadow of the woman he had once loved, and for a brief moment, his heart ached. But the pain was fleeting, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Daddy," his son called, pulling him out of his trance. Mark turned, forcing a smile onto his face as he watched Linda dart away, her eyes never meeting his. He knew she was still afraid of him, still running from the truth of what she had done. It was a victory, but a hollow one. "Let's go," he said to his family, steering them away from the direction Linda had fled. "We've got ice cream to catch up with." The market was a riot of colors and smells, the sounds of life a comforting cacophony. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but think of the woman he had once loved, now lost to the winds of fate. But he had his own family now, a love that was pure and true. And as he looked down at Emily, her hand in his, he knew that in the end, he had won the most important battle of all, the battle for his own happiness. 15 years had passed since that fateful night. Mark had built a life that was everything he had ever wanted: a loving wife, 2 beautiful children, and a successful career. They had faced challenges, but together they had overcome them, their love a bastion against the storm. The encounter in the market had left Mark unsettled, but he pushed the memories aside, focusing on the present. He had a family now, a life that was far from the one he had shared with Linda. Yet, her ghost lingered, a silent reminder of the price of ambition. One evening, as he was reading a bedtime story to his kids, the doorbell rang. His heart pounded as he went to answer it, expecting the worst. But instead, he found a letter on the doorstep, Linda's handwriting unmistakable. He didn't dare open it in front of his family, so he waited until they were asleep. In the quiet of the night, Mark read her words, the ink smudged with tears. She confessed her sins, her regret a palpable force that seemed to emanate from the page. She had seen the life he had built without her and knew she could never be a part of it. She begged for his forgiveness, but Mark knew that was a gift she would never receive from him. He crumpled the letter, tossing it into the fireplace. As the flames consumed her words, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The past was dead and buried, and Linda was nothing more than a faded photograph in a forgotten album. He climbed into bed, wrapping his arms around Emily, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "It's over," he whispered into the darkness. "It's all over." The years rolled by, and Mark watched his children grow into strong, compassionate adults, the echoes of Linda's betrayal fading into the background. He had found true love with Emily, and their bond had only grown stronger with time. They had built a life together that was full of joy and free from the shackles of the past, but fate had one last twist in store for him. One rainy afternoon, while picking up groceries, Mark saw a familiar face. It was Linda, her once beautiful features haggard, her eyes sunken with the weight of her guilt. She had not aged well, the years of fear and regret etched into every line on her face. He felt a strange mix of pity and anger, his heart tightening at the sight of her. "Linda," he said, his voice low and even. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. Mark," she stuttered, clutching her purse to her chest. "You're looking, well," he lied, noticing the tremor in her hand. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "I never meant for things to end like that. I just wanted. I don't know what I wanted." "It's in the past," Mark said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've moved on." Her gaze searched his face, looking for any sign of the love they once shared. But all she found was a man at peace with his life, a man who had built a new world from the ashes of their old one. "I'm happy for you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. "You should be," Mark said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You gave me the push I needed to find my true path." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Linda standing in the rain, watching him disappear into the distance. He had won the ultimate battle, the battle to find happiness without her. Years passed, and Mark's life continued to flourish. His career soared, and his family grew. He had 2 wonderful children, a son named Jack and a daughter named Lily, who brought joy to every corner of his life. He had never spoken to Linda again, content to leave their tumultuous past behind. One day, as he was leaving work, Mark saw a young intern, her eyes filled with the same ambition that had once burned in Linda's. He couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. He approached her, offering guidance and support, determined not to let history repeat itself. "Remember," he said, his eyes serious, "the climb to the top isn't always worth the view." The intern nodded, a spark of understanding in her eyes. Mark hoped she would learn from his story, that she would find success without losing herself along the way. 15 years had passed since that fateful encounter in the market. Mark had grown older, his hair now peppered with gray, but his heart was fuller than it had ever been. His children were off at college, and Emily had become his rock, the love of his life. As they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset, Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I never knew about Linda. But I always knew there was something in your past that you didn't talk about." Mark took a deep breath, the memories flooding back. "It's not something I'm proud of," he admitted. "But it made me the man I am today." Emily leaned into him, her hand resting gently on his cheek. "You're a good man, Mark," she whispered. "A strong man. And I'm so grateful for that." Their children had grown up, and Mark often found himself reminiscing about the past. But it was the quiet moments with Emily that brought him the most joy. One such evening, as they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars, she turned to him with a mischievous smile. "You know," she said, "I found something in the attic today." "What is it?" he asked, curiosity piqued. Emily pulled out a crumpled letter from her pocket. It was the one Linda had left on the doorstep all those years ago. "It's from your past," she said, her voice filled with understanding. Mark took the letter, the edges still charred from the fireplace. "I thought I'd burned it," he murmured. "You did," she said, her smile gentle. "But some things refuse to be forgotten." Together, they watched the stars, the echoes of the past, a distant memory. They had built a life that was theirs, untouched by the shadows of what once was. And in that moment, Mark knew that he had truly found the happiness he deserved.